twin shorelines at the end of my name, traffickers of white space. You could last on the tongue forever, lolling, longing, an endless drawing out of the little stream between you. Fill my life. I drink from the narrowest canal flowing between two countries that, half of the time, claim me. Double L, bring me back to the in-between where my breath has always lived, without containment, like two legs pointing toward the ocean or these arms reaching into sky. From birth, you have doubled my grief and my wonder, shown me the parallel which can never touch, the way I run alongside my love without entering his true mind. Rivulet of secrets, slim as a eucalyptus leaf, airplane runway of the heart. Double L, let my days always move in two directions. Build me a channel into which I can pour this voice.
Thank you so much for starting off with that poem. It's honestly so awesome. And I love the way that it gets us started by throwing up one of the kind of thematic balls of the manuscript, and that being this idea of doubleness and doubling with the double L. So could you talk about how that theme kind of ends up being an obsession? And could you also talk about how you use that to kind of structure the book?
So the book is organized in two sections. So there's that doubleness, but I think that it really came to me in my writing, I think just from life itself. So being an only child, and there are some poems in here that kind of go between like the couplet and the singlet, going back and forth. But being an only child in a household with both my parents, it's like I'm presented with these two people. And so I'm constantly thinking about like the world that I'm entering through these two people, and then also being born in San Francisco and eventually being raised in the Central Valley, but kind of having those roots in San Francisco and always conscious of the Pacific Ocean right there, and just what is on the other side of that ocean, which for me was, my mom is from Malaysia, and so thinking about like here versus there, what's my family over there doing versus my family here, whenever we would fly. Being on the plane, the back of the seat has that screen showing the plane kind of going over the ocean endlessly for hours and hours and hours. And noticing that that was the same thing I would look at when we would go to Breaker Beach in San Francisco. So I think that's sort of the root of doubleness that I'm thinking about in my poetry, and then it just kind of goes from there. Then I'm seeing doubleness everywhere, but I think that's really the start of it.
Yeah, no, this kind of bifurcated state of being, if you will. And of course, that reminds me, because of the body that I wear, of W.E. Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, you know, these two warring ideas in one body. Really, he emphasizes that warring ideas and has a black man who was oftentimes the only black man in the room and in white spaces. I really identified with the kind of warring of like kind of my white American identity that like I was learning to espouse from school versus like kind of the way I was acculturated at home. So do you feel like the double consciousness kind of lands for you being, you know, a multiracial person?
Yeah. I would say the first time I heard about Du Bois's double consciousness in college, I don't remember what class it was, but I was a sociology major and it came in one of our classes. And I remember thinking like, that sounds so resonant to me, right? And I was like, although I'm not African American, that's not my background. And so I was still kind of working through like, well, what does that mean to me, right? And then later in undergrad, also reading Frantz Fanon.
Yes.
So then it started kind of moving into like the colonial, post-colonial for me, and I was matching together both Du Bois's double consciousness and then Fanon talking about white skin, black skin, white masks.
Yes.
And then, but it wasn't until the PhD, and I read Johan Ramazani, and he has a concept very similar, but called stereoscopic vision. And his idea was that, you know, for the immigrant, for the post-colonial subject, you know, abroad, that there's the version of themselves that's here, and then also remembering the land before, and like seeing both at once, and how that is so suited to poetry because we are all about metaphors, right? And similes and comparisons. So he's like, it's already a sort of like poetic existence to always be comparing these two realities.
You can almost click into it, like so now I'm looking this way, now I'm looking that way. And I think one of the most exciting things for the text for me is the way that the speaker is always traveling between the worlds or even being asked to choose. And specifically, I think, you know, there's an awesome poem in which like we can get at the poet being asked to kind of choose, even from a younger age, choose identities. So I was wondering if you could read from Customs, and let's hear from that.
Yeah, I would say I love that point about like choosing and choice before I read that, because I think that is also an element for me that I don't think is as present in the Du Bois concept, because I mean, the impression I get is that for Black folks, it's like everything's like immediate, experienced in the moment, right? And I mean, there's a past too, but I think for me as someone who's like a daughter of immigrant, I'm thinking about my generation versus an earlier generation. And also being multiracial, I mean, I have a half of me that is like sort of in the mainstream, or it has more privilege. And so that element of, there's an added tension there. At the airport, after a long journey, a mother and father divide like a cell, foreign and domestic, into their respective lines for citizens and non-citizens. The child is small enough to run beneath the rope that skims the top of her skull, splitting her family into parallel routes to the same house. The girl passes from line to line beneath the gaze of the customs officer. No one has caught her yet, going back and forth. She swings like a spider between 2 points, building something nearly invisible. Go to the other side with your father, says the mother. As tall as suitcases, boxes at eye level, the girl becomes a piece of luggage in transit. She has nothing that can be confiscated. She doesn't even hold her own passport. The adults slide it across the appropriate counter for an off-center stamp on an unmarked page. Already, she no longer resembles the child's photo, iridescent and crosshatched by the advanced security features covering her face. Even her name has an expiration date, when someday she is married and will change it. For now, the child belongs to no one and no country. Everything is impermanent. Her loyalties might shift according to a game she makes of jumping over the dark tiles in the airport floor.
Oh my goodness. I think besides just the conceit and the metaphor and how it just resonates and shows how the speaker was just given that choice over and over again. And I think one of the words that I really want to put a lot of pressure on is passes. Passes, like such a great word choice. Of course, because of the weight of it, again, because bringing up Du Bois, we're in the world of the New Negro and the Harlem Renaissance, and so that gets us to these ideas of passing. And I think about that when it comes to multiracial bodies and this idea of passing. And then when we get back to this idea of choice versus burden versus privilege. And I was wondering, do you know, for you, does your identity feel liminal, kind of between places? I know there's a lot, and we can get to poems that get at that betweenness, or does it kind of feel more of the bothness?
It's the bothness, right? Like I'm always in both. And in that poem, it wasn't until I was writing it that I realized I'm trying to go to the place where it used to be liminal. You know, and it can't be anymore, I think, like just through age. And but when you're a child, I think especially for multiracial kids, like all kids' features are changing all the time as we're getting older. And I think for me growing up, like I had phases depending on what my hair looked like, if I was wearing glasses, contacts, whatever, I could tell that I was read as more Asian versus white. And so I think at that point, in that poem, I don't say how old the speaker is, but I was imagining like 4 years old. I do mention like the rope that separates these aisles. So I'm thinking like, if people can imagine a person who could run underneath that rope. So that's about the age that I'm thinking of.
And you're like young enough to where you can like get under ideology even, you know, right? And I think that that's really powerful about that image as well.
Right. There's also a line about like being a spider swinging between points, building something invisible. And so I was also thinking about like that child who didn't even really understand what race was. Like I knew of family here and there, right? And that's so much in the book too, right? So trying to go back to that idea of like, what's identity before we put words to it, you know, citizens, non-citizens. I'm so much more both because I have to anticipate people reading me as either in any moment. And so I know there's like a certain level of privilege that comes with being mixed, because I know I'm not being read as Asian all the time, but I don't know when that's gonna happen. So I can't like bank on it, you know, because I'll get thrown off. Sometimes I forget and I'll get thrown off by a very random, you know, slur that somebody says, and it's like, whoa, I didn't see that coming. And then other times I'm sure my privilege is just totally under the radar to me, and it doesn't come up and I don't have to see it.
When I think about your work, I again think about how deliberate it is, and just like everything feels so purposeful in your poetry. And I think because of that, there's a real clarity there. So could you talk a little bit about craft and about how you land in just such precise places?
For me, it's always like, what word do I want to end on? That's always the thing that I'm thinking about. And so as I tend to, well, earlier in my writing, many of the poems in here, I wrote longhand, like handwriting. And since I've become a parent, now a lot more goes in the phone. You know, like I'm like, got one kid in one arm and I got the phone in the other. Or if I'm driving somewhere and I'm like, Siri, start a new note, and I'm just speaking to the 405 or the 110 or whatever it might be. But sometimes as I'm like talking aloud or writing out, I know there's a word that I want to end on. And that's usually like the key to the rest of the form.
Wow.
Really, for me, it's like if there's this one word that says, I need to be the end word, this needs to sort of echo for a while, then I'll see, okay, then where does that line want to start? And then all the other lines usually end up kind of following suit. And then I'll look at it, I'm like, is this an even number? You know, and I just start playing with like stanza breaks at that point. But yeah, I think that's sort of the angle that I take from it. And then reading aloud, of course, always has to be read aloud. I know you can't always hear forms when we read them aloud, but if I can like feel that there's some kind of rhythm underneath it that the form is providing, then I feel like I'm at peace with it. This poem is called Between, and I'm actually going to read it twice because it is a contrapuntal poem. It's written in 2 columns, which can be read either across, kind of jumping over the middle space, or it can be read down one column and then the second column. So what I'm going to do is first read it across and then vertically.
Before you read that, I just want to talk about how much I dig that also enacts the multiplicity and the simultaneity of the speaker's existence. Like Denise Levertov always used to talk about, you know, in what is it, some notes on organic form, that form should be a revelation of content. And I think that there was never a more beautiful moment of form being revelation of content than that right there.
Thanks. I had wanted to write a poem in that form for so long, and I tried to force it. I was like, what would be the perfect poem that could be in this contrapuntal form? I could never figure it out. And then it wasn't until writing this poem out by hand, didn't plan for it to be in this form. And, you know, I mentioned earlier, like, I would get a sense of where I want the line to end. And I was really struggling with this one because I was like, I can't tell if these want to be short lines or long lines. So I had all these possible line breaks, and I was like, all of these sound like they have long lines, and there's a spot in the middle where I also want to break. And then I was like, could this be my chance? Could this be the contrapuntal poem that I've always wanted to write? And so then it wasn't until I typed it up and I did a little bit of tweaking, and then it worked. So, but I think it'd been at least a few years where I had it in the back of my mind. I want to write this poem, but I don't know what's going to be the form or what's going to be the content to fill that form. So, all right. So this is Between. Half my life grows quiet. the words crossed out by a language, what I do not have. I carry it like a corpse or a doll, blinking its Morse code. Sometimes my mother, her mouth opening and closing, a silence I cannot translate. Other times my father, speaking static and English, my twin inheritances, braided rope, whatever manages to clothe me. Today, the body I drag behind me, another self, hair gathering dirt everywhere I go. This throat and its sounds, a music without meaning. So tired, I cannot leave. I sit her up, leaning against a tree. Tie dandelions into rings around all her fingers, counting time. Here's the second version of the poem read vertically. Half the words, a language, I carry it or a doll. Sometimes her mouth a silence, other times speaking static, my twin inheritances, whatever manages. Today the body, another self, everywhere I go, a music. So tired, I sit her up, tie dandelions around all her fingers. My life grows quiet, crossed out by what I do not have, like a corpse blinking its Morse code. My mother opening and closing, I cannot translate. My father and English, braided rope to clothe me. I drag behind me, hair gathering dirt, this throat and its sounds without meaning. I cannot leave, leaning against a tree, into rings, counting time.
I feel as though that the Pantoum gets used so often as you, so by you rather. So could you talk about choosing to use that form?
When it comes to Pantoum, I have to start with my first impression of the form, not even knowing its origins. It was Natasha Trethewey's Native Guard, and of course she's got poems that are in form, and then she has free verse poems. And I was already a little bit like geeking out on forms. I loved the villanelle, which also repeats, loved the sestina, and there was something about poems that repeated words. I was really into that, not so much like the meter and the rhyme. And I thought there's something really like less, this is a weird word to use, formal, but like less serious or like staid about it, but like an urgency. So, I loved those forms. And then I came across her Pantoum in that book, which is, I'm blanking for a moment, Incident.
Yes.
Calling up County Cullen.
Yes. What the incident when he gets called inward, of course.
Yes. So her Pantoum Incident, and I was like, I need to write this form. I need to write a poem in this form. What is this? And I got out my, I think it's Ron Padgett's Book of Forms that I had in my form and theory class. I was getting my MFA at the time, and I looked at Pantoum, and I was like, from Malaysia, and I was like, how come I've never heard of Here I am getting an MFA in poetry, and
that's
I had no
literally
idea.
When you learned about it?
From a book, right?
Wow.
I call up my mom, and I was like, Mom, how come you didn't tell me there's a poem for from Malaysia? This is what I'm studying. This is pretty exciting for me. Because so many of these forms that we have in American poetry, like, kind of have these European origins. Of course. I mentioned villanelle, sestina, sonnets, of course.
Most Italian or French usually.
Yeah. And so I was like, but here's one from Malaysia? Like, I was like, I thought Asians had the haiku, and that was right at that part of my writing career. And so my mom was like, oh, yeah, we had to recite those in school as a kid. I was like, what? So I think about, like, is there something sort of like, I don't know, I don't want to say like in my DNA or genes or something, but I felt like this attraction immediately to this form. I should also note, though, it is a Malay form, so this is even going before the concept of like Malaysia as a nation, like when the British colonized it and the Dutch were in Indonesia and all those sort of borders are being drawn. So, and my family's not ethnically Malay, we're indigenous Badayu. So it's sort of like an adjacent culture in that way. But really the Pantoum started out as just the quatrain. So it used to just be 4 lines, that's it. And so it would be like the first 2 lines would be something more concrete, like an observation. It could be like a certain insect crawling along.
So in that way, kind of like the haiku, right? Like that you start out with the direct image.
Could be, yeah. And then usually the second 2 lines are like more of like the proverb or the message.
Okay.
And then you realize like, oh, that's what the image was trying to convey, and now we're saying it directly. So that's sort of like the core of it. But then what the French had picked up on was a variation of that braids in, quatrain after quatrain, and that's the one that we usually see in American poetry.
And so that's where we get the 2 and 4 become 1 and 3, right?
Yes, and so like those 2 lines keep kind of repeating in this way, and then usually the first line comes back at the end. So yeah, should I read that poem?
I can't wait to hear it. Can't wait to hear it.
Pantoum. Although my relatives are strangers, I sleep with him on their floors in a country I'm only visiting. A line of gongs through a window wake me from sleep on the floor on the morning of Gawai, the harvest. Gongs line up past the window without a screen to sift the ringing metal, so I know it is Gawai, the harvest. At the sill, I search for people gathering. No screen to sift the ringing metal, and expect his face in the distance. At the sill, I search for people gathering, and because he looks like a tourist, expect his face to appear, even distant. The thin mattress beside me was empty. In my life, he became a tourist. His camera is missing from its case. The thin mattress beside me, emptied, gives up the imprint of his body. His camera, unzipped from its case, records my absence in photographs, so I give up the imprint of his body like a language I've heard since I was born. He takes photos without me while I am down the stairs barefoot, following a language I've heard since I was born, stepping through mud toward the road. I am down the stairs now, barefoot, in a country I've only visited. Stepping through mud toward the road, I am a relative who is a stranger.
I think another thing that this poem gets at is like the speaker's relationship to language. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how so much of your life that you've been inside of language, like with English, but then also outside of language, like when your mother's speaking on the phone, or just like knowing that you're that far away from your mother tongue even.
Everything is sort of blurred. It's almost like a double exposure, right? Of like a picture that you see 2 things, but they're both a little bit blurry. And that opening line, when I think like, in terms of like my own life, there's that line about like my relatives are strangers. I'm like, my relatives aren't strangers, and I'm like, but the speaker feels like maybe the relatives are strangers, or maybe a little bit. And then by the end of the poem, it's like, no, I'm a relative and I'm a stranger, and it's about me and it's not about them, right? Because there's not even a they in that final line. So that's something that I love about the form, at least how it's practiced in English, is that so many of us who use it like want to tweak things in, using the same words, but then the meaning kind of shifts a little bit. That's something that I think is powerful about repeating forms like the Pantoum.
I realize, with your father developing photos for so long, that's also doubling, and that's also, again, an image like happening twice, and the distance between like the photo versus the actual occurrence. And like, what does it mean to be a person who's making images rise out of nothing? And like how beautiful it is that the poet's father, that was his job.
Yeah, so that was a delight in my childhood, but it also definitely gave me a sense of like art and expression even before writing.
Looking is already framing.
Everything kind of comes down to that rectangular shape most of the time. I know there's that, yes, the picture and then also the book, right?
Well
so,
played.
I mean, I know that there's some really innovative poets who are doing radical things with decks of cards and, accordion pages and stuff.
Yeah, no.
But I think a lot of our poems have to end up in the rectangular form at some point if a journal wants to publish it or an anthology or something. My father's work. Even when we move 70 miles outside of San Francisco, my father drives back on weekdays as if to pick up where I started and he did, and his father and another father before him. This year makes 30 he spent developing the film containing other people's lives in a drugstore on Ocean Avenue. He unrolls the brown ticker tape where everyone appears reversed, even our own family, those miniatures still in their paper sleeves, though he presses the glossy prints into album pages under cellophane. You could find heavy books of us at the bottom of our hallway closet, every moment that has passed through his fingers. And beneath their shelf, the neat stacks of film in strips, dark versions you could arrange in any order or pick the one you like best. Like my father did in my first year when I was barely able to stand but smiling. In the negative, how bright our old house would seem around me, window casting a shadow over my face.
It's so gorgeous, and that you get to be the shadow and the self, that almost like you end in a doubled image. So beautiful.
Yeah.